On April 20th, 2010, the Deepwater Horizon disaster changed the lives of millions living near the Gulf of Mexico, as well as the scientists who responded to the crisis. These are some of their stories, intimate portraits of research, innovation, discovery. Welcome, I'm Jim McNamee, editor of Dispatches from the Gulf. Dr. Kendra Daly is an oceanographer at the University of South Florida. In this final Story Collider episode, Dr. Daly tells wild stories from her many research cruises, including how her first journey almost became a sacrifice to the Mayan fire god.
My story starts in the summer of 1979. I was on a research vessel in the Bering Sea off the coast of Alaska. It was chilly like the Bering Sea usually is, foggy. Occasionally the mist would part and we'd see the towering cliffs of Pribilof Islands, and then the mist would close back in again. I was using an acoustic system to map the abundance and distribution of zooplankton and fish. Zooplankton are little tiny animals that drift in the ocean. And the acoustic system is like a depth finder on a fishing vessel. We send sound waves down in the water column, and when it hits a target like a zooplankton or a fish, it reflects that sound back up to the surface and tells us something about the depth and the type of organism it is. There was another scientist on the ship that was a NOAA administrator, and he was organizing an emergency response team for the Ixtoc oil spill. The Ixtoc wellhead had blown out earlier that summer in June and was spewing oil into the southern Gulf of Mexico in a very shallow coastal system about 50 meters deep. It was the largest oil spill at the time. It ended up not being capped until March the following year. And in that time period, it ended up spewing oil over much of the southern Gulf of Mexico, with oil ending up in many of the Mexican beaches and along Texas. So the scientist asked me if I'd be willing to participate in this emergency response team, and more importantly, could I bring my acoustic system along, which meant shipping it almost immediately after we got back to Seattle. So I said yes. I was actually very excited. I thought it sounded like a real adventure. I could help save the planet. Not only that, but it was in the tropics, warm weather, azure seas, swimming dolphins. Much better than the Bering Sea. Well, I was wrong. It was one of the most horrendous cruises of my life. And I think probably most people felt the same way. The first thing that happened was a hurricane struck Miami just as we were supposed to be leaving. So that delayed the trip. We finally all arrived and gathered, took a day or two to set up our equipment on the ships, and finally departed. There were two ships working together. One was a contract vessel from Tracor Marine that I was on. It was a relatively small ship with not a large lab space. The other ship was a big, large, beautiful white NOAA vessel that couldn't go into the oil for various reasons. In part, we always thought on the other ship because they didn't want to get their hull dirty. But they had a lot more lab space, and so we went into the oil collecting samples and then transferred them to this gorgeous white vessel that stood off by helicopter. They had their own personal helicopter or ships. So we finally were in transit, and we were issued our protective clothing, gear, gas masks that I think were from the Korean War, if not World War II. They were the most horrible things you can imagine. They smelled awful. And then all of these coveralls and gloves. This was my first experience in the Gulf of Mexico. And as we heard from the previous speakers, it's hot. It's really hot. So all this clothing, you just sweat. It's awful. So we arrived at the oil spill, and the fumes were unbelievable. I always knew that I was sensitive to organic fumes, but it turns out I am really sensitive to organic fumes, probably more than most people. And it was like a vice grip, throbbing headache the entire time we were working down there. So it was And then a storm hit. So we had high seas. Everyone was seasick. The Mexican observers never got out of their bunks. But you have to work through all that. So it's throbbing headache from the oil, wearing the gas mask, sweating, nausea. It was really fun. You should have all been there. So the very first station, I'm deploying this very expensive net. And today, it probably cost about $100,000. It was an opening closing net. Attach it to the wire, put it over the side of the ship. I'm watching it move slowly away from the ship, and the wire breaks. Apparently, in the rush to organize this cruise, they had borrowed some wire and a winch and not tested it, and the wire had rusted through. Fortunately, I had a little backup net that I could use, so I did collect samples. And then later on the cruise, I was doing an acoustic survey, and someone yelled, and I turned around, and my acoustic echo sounder, smoke spewing out. It had overheated, so I pulled all the power cords out. This was 1979, so we did not have solid-state electronics. We had vacuum tubes. And I was a Girl Scout, so I came prepared, and there was a very clever electrical engineer on board who repaired the system, so all was not lost. I was still able to work. So finally, the cruise came to an end, and we decided to do a little sightseeing before we left the area. We wanted to go up closer to the wellhead, where there was this huge fire as the oil spewed out. So we approached slowly with the ship. I was up in the bridge, the wheelhouse, with the captain. I was still trying to pretend I was avoiding oil fumes, and everybody else was out on deck around the railing. And all of a sudden, the ship started vibrating. And I looked over at the captain to see what was going on. I couldn't figure out why it was vibrating. And I noticed he was staring very fixedly ahead. It looked pale white, and he was clutching the wheel. He was trying to reverse the ship, but we were still moving forward. We were being sucked into this vortex around this huge fire. And obviously, I'm here today. Eventually, the ship did respond. We were able to back out. Interestingly enough, Ixtoc is the name of the Mayan fire god. So we were almost the sacrifice to Ixtoc, I think. It was a long time before we calmed down and started sailing home for Galveston. But that wasn't the end of it. The ship actually had two twin shafts and props. One of them ended up breaking. We could still steer, but it meant we had a very long, slow ride home, much longer than anticipated. And by that time, we all were really sick and tired. We really wanted to get home. Still high seas, still stormy, but most of the seas were following, so the ship rode a little better. We had thunderstorms, and one day there were 7 waterspouts on the horizon, and I had never seen waterspouts before. I have seen large tornadoes before and was very much aware of the damage they could cause, but I was reassured that these little waterspouts wouldn't do anything, so we watched them play on the horizon. That was probably the most fun time we had the whole trip. So we got home, got on dry land, and I swore I would never, ever go to the Gulf of Mexico again, and I certainly never wanted to go to another oil spill. But never say never. About 16 years ago, I moved to St. Petersburg, here on the other side of Tampa Bay. I joined the faculty at the University of South Florida in the College of Marine Science, and I discovered the charms of the Gulf of Mexico, the white sandy beaches, the nice, beautiful winters. I still don't like summer here. But I live on the water. I have dolphins and manatees in my backyard. You know, it's pretty magical here. And then disaster struck. April of 2010, the Deepwater Horizon platform exploded, killing and injuring a number of people. In the ensuing days, I think everybody wondered what was going on. Here it was, another environmental disaster. We were wondering what was going to happen. And then I thought, frankly, oh no, I don't want to have anything to do with that. Fortunately, there were a number of people in our college who volunteered to go out on cruises almost immediately, one of which was a man that worked for me. So he went out on these cruises. My group uses a towed camera system. So we collect images of small phytoplankton, or little plants, and zooplankton, and also particulate matter, which Jim just described as sea snot. It's quite insulting. In ocean sciences, we call it marine snow. But anyways, Drew came back from this cruise and he was all excited because of all this particulate matter that he had seen and he thought was unusually high. So I'll come back to the particulate matter in a little bit. So it was kind of May, June timeframe. It was a very confusing time. There were lots of activities going on. There was a huge response effort. Multiple federal agencies were involved, state agencies, scientists were going out on cruises. We didn't know where they were all going, who was doing what, where we could fit into this response effort. And then the University of South Florida, the upper administration, offered to give our college some funding to support ship time so that we could go out as well and help the response effort. And my dean at the time asked me to help organize that effort, and I actually told him no twice. But he persisted, and there was a sense of urgency. We all wanted to help out in some way, so I finally gave in. I had a number of other large projects that were very time sensitive, but everybody put everything on hold. It was just everybody was volunteering and dropping everything they were doing to help out. So we held a number of large meetings, a lot of faculty, staff, students, members from other state agencies, federal agencies in the area. One of the speakers you'll hear in a few minutes, Steve, came down from Washington, D.C. to brief us on events that were happening up there. We decided that for our first cruise, we were going to sample off the Florida coast. We felt responsible for the state of Florida, and there were lots of indications that the oil might be coming down along the Florida coast, maybe even all the way as far as the Keys or further. So we had quite a few discussions about how to sample, where to sample. And by sampling, I mean we have a variety of different instruments and platforms. We put a big frame structure called a rosette that has water bottles on it. We can put it into the water column and electronically trigger them to collect water at different depths. When we bring the water back, we can make lots of different measurements on it, like temperature, salinity, oxygen, nutrients. Using a net to collect zooplankton and a camera imaging system to get pictures of all the things we were seeing in the water column. So we went out in July and sampled along the West Florida coast. And then, as you probably all remember, the wellhead was capped finally at the end of July. Our next cruise in August, we went up to the oil spill area, and even though it was a few weeks later, there still was measurable oil in the water column, and we made all the same types of measurements. Although serendipity, again, a big storm came through, and we had to go into shore early. We couldn't collect all the measurements we want, but we still got quite a bit done. And I was very fortunate in the following 4 years to get more funding, and we continued going out to sea. And here's my disclaimer. I didn't go out to sea at all. It was people that worked with me and other faculty and students. We had teachers in training. We had film crews. We had photographers. We had a lot of people going out. It was a very busy time. We completed 22 cruises and really amassed a pretty unique data set. And one of the outcomes of all these data was a realization that this marine snow was really an important element in the whole oil spill. It turned out to be a major pathway by which oil sank to the seafloor. And this was an unexpected event and has received a lot of attention, but it turns out that this has happened before. In fact, it happened at Ixtoc and several other smaller oil spills around the world. Last August, a group of scientists from CMH, which I'm a participant in, as are some of the other speakers that are here today, they went down to Ixtoc and sampled the sediments down there in order to learn more about how oil is degraded over time. It's been over 35 years. And about the recovery of that benthic system, the animals that live on the seafloor. And so hopefully what they learned in that system will help us better understand what the fate is of the oil at Deepwater Horizon. Thank you.
Today, thousands of scientists, oceanographers, chemists, engineers, biologists are all working together to develop newer and better ways to understand and ease the impact of oil spills. To learn more about their work, visit our webpage at dispatchesfromthegulf.com. Funding for this podcast was provided by a grant by the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative. And thanks for listening.